Before there were empires, before pyramids rose above the deserts of Egypt, before Greece, Rome, or Babylon shaped the course of history, there was Sumer. On a broad and difficult plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers human beings crossed an invisible threshold. Small villages became cities. Simple marks became writing. Local leaders became kings. Temples rose above crowded streets. Trade stretched across mountains, deserts, and seas. And for the first time, civilization began to resemble the world we know today. Yet Sumer did not emerge in a land of obvious abundance. Southern Mesopotamia had little stone, almost no timber, and rainfall too uncertain to support large populations. The summer heat could be severe. The rivers that gave life to the plain could also change course, destroy fields, and overwhelm settlements. It appeared to be an unlikely birthplace for urban civilization. But this difficult environment forced people to cooperate in ways they had never done before, and that cooperation changed humanity forever. The story begins in Mesopotamia, a name later used by the Greeks to describe the land between the rivers. To the north, rainfall could support agriculture more easily, but in the southern plains, farming depended upon water management. Communities dug channels from the rivers into their fields. They constructed embankments to control floods. They drained marshes. They stored grain. They repaired canals, season after season. No single family could maintain such a system alone. The work required organization. Organization required authority. Authority required records, leadership, labor, and rules. The canal was more than an agricultural tool. It became one of the foundations of the state. As fields expanded and food production increased, settlements grew larger. More people could leave farming and specialize in other work. Some became potters. Others became metalworkers, builders, merchants, soldiers, priests, or administrators. A society once organized mainly around extended families was becoming something far more complex. By the 4th millennium before Christ, enormous settlements had begun to appear in southern Mesopotamia. Among them were Eridu, Uruk, Ur-Nippur, Lagash-Kish, and Umma. They were not united as one nation. Each city controlled its own territory, worshipped its own patron deity, and competed with its neighbors for land, water, labor, and prestige. These were city-states. Each one was a political world of its own. At the center of the city stood the temple. To modernize, a temple may appear to be only a place of worship. In Sumer, it was much more. The temple controlled farmland. It stored grain. It employed workers. It supervised textile production. It organized offerings and festivals. It managed livestock. It redistributed food. Religion, economics, and government were deeply connected. The city was believed to belong to its god, or goddess. Its people worked beneath divine authority. Its ruler governed with the approval of heaven. If the harvest prospered, the gods had shown favor. If an enemy attacked priests, sought divine guidance. If a city fell, its people might conclude that its god had withdrawn protection. This belief gave the temple enormous power. It also shaped how the Sumerians understood civilization itself. To them, urban life was not merely a human invention. It was part of a sacred order. One ancient tradition claimed that kingship had descended from heaven. The implication was clear. Political authority was not simply seized by force. It was granted by the divine realm. But beneath these sacred claims stood very human systems of labor, taxation, competition, and control. The rise of Sumer was both a spiritual story and a political revolution. No city better represents that transformation than Uruk. At its height, Uruk may have been one of the largest cities on earth. Its walls enclosed neighborhoods, workshops, public buildings, and enormous temple complexes. Thousands of people lived in close proximity. They bought and sold goods. They attended festivals. They labored on construction projects. They transported grain. They shaped clay. They followed officials, priests, and rulers. For perhaps the first time, human beings were learning how to live among large numbers of strangers. Life in a village was built around people who knew one another. Life in a city required systems, measurements, standards, schedules, contracts, ration, official authority. The larger Uruk became, the more difficult it was to manage. Memory alone was no longer enough. An administrator could not simply remember how much barley had entered a storehouse, which worker had received a ration, or how many sheep belonged to the temple. The city had become too complicated. A new technology was needed. At first, administrators used physical tokens to represent goods. A small clay object might stand for a measure of grain. Another might represent an animal. These tokens could be placed inside clay containers and sealed. Over time, people began pressing the shapes of the tokens onto the outside of the container. Eventually, the marks became more important than the objects themselves. The system evolved. Pictures became symbols. Symbols became standardized signs. A sharpened reed was pressed into wet clay, leaving wedge-shaped impressions. This writing system became known as cuneiform. Writing was born not from poetry but from administration. Its earliest purpose was practical. Count the grain, record the animals, track the workers, preserve the transaction. But once the technology existed, its possibilities expanded rapidly. Scribes began recording names, titles, prayers, hymns, laws, royal victories, medical treatments, astronomical observations, school exercises, myths. Human speech had escaped the limits of memory. A person could die, yet the words remained. A ruler could issue a command that reached distant officials. A merchant could prove that payment had been made. A priest could preserve a ritual for future generations. A student could copy the same lesson as countless students before him. Civilization had created an external memory, un archive, and that archive would survive the destruction of the civilization that created it. Clay was everywhere in southern Mesopotamia. The Sumerians built with it. They wrote on it. They sealed documents with it. They shaped vessels from it. In a land with little stone or wood, mud became the material of civilization. Bricks were formed by hand and dried in the sun. Some were fired for greater durability. Bitumen, a naturally occurring petroleum substance, was sometimes used as mortar or waterproofing. With these simple materials, Sumerian builders created walls, courtyards, platforms, storehouses, palaces, and temples. The most imposing structures rose above the flat plain like artificial mountains. These elevated temple platforms eventually developed into the monumental structures, now known as ziggurats. A ziggurat was not a tomb like an Egyptian pyramid. It was a stepped sacred platform, supporting a temple. Its purpose was religious, political, and visual. From far beyond the city walls, travelers could see it rising above the horizon. It announced the identity of the city. It displayed its wealth. It embodied the authority of its god. And it reminded everyone below that the sacred world stood above ordinary life. The Mesopotamian plain had no great natural mountains. So, the Sumerians built their own, brick by brick, basket by basket, worker by worker. These structures required organized labor on an extraordinary scale. Thousands of people had to produce bricks, transport materials, prepare food, and follow a central plan. Monumental architecture was therefore not merely a sign of religious devotion. It was evidence of administrative power. A city capable of building a massive temple platform was a city capable of commanding labor. The skyline of Sumer revealed the strength of its institutions. But the same systems that created cities also created inequality. Some people controlled land. Some managed grain. Some interpreted divine will. Some commanded soldiers. Others carried baskets of mud under the burning sun. The city brought opportunity, security, trade, and cultural achievement. It also concentrated wealth and authority. Civilization had become capable of producing wonders. It had also become capable of organizing exploitation. This contradiction lies at the heart of Sumer's story. The Sumerians were innovators, but they were not modern people living in an ancient setting. Their world was shaped by beliefs very different from our own. They did not separate religion from nature. The sky, the river, the storm, the moon, fertility, wisdom, and war were associated with divine powers. The gods were believed to control the forces upon which human survival depended. Yet these deities were not always portrayed as morally perfect. They could compete, become angry, deceive, reward, destroy. Humanity existed within a cosmic order that could never be taken for granted. One failed harvest might threaten an entire city. One shift in the river could ruin years of work. One invading army could carry away grain statues and captives. Life was fragile. Ritual offered a sense of order. The temple offered stability. The king offered protection, but none of them could guarantee peace. As Sumerian cities became wealthier, they began competing more violently. Water became a source of conflict. Farmland became a source of conflict. Trade routes became a source of conflict. City walls grew stronger. Weapons improved. Rulers celebrated their victories in inscriptions and monuments. The same organizational power that dug canals could mobilize armies. The same writing that recorded grain could record tribute from defeated enemies. The same temple that promised divine order could justify conquest. Human progress did not eliminate violence. It made violence more organized. And this raises one of the deepest questions in the history of civilization. Did Sumer make humanity better? Or did it simply make humanity more powerful? The answer is not simple. Sumerian innovation improved life in countless ways. Irrigation fed large populations. Writing preserved knowledge. Law created standards. Trade connected distant regions. Mathematics made administration and construction more precise. Cities supported art, music, education, and skilled craftsmanship. But every new form of power could serve more than one purpose. A wall could protect a family. It could also trap a conquered population. A written law could defend the weak. It could also preserve the privilege of the powerful. A temple could inspire reverence. It could also control immense resources. Technology did not determine morality. It magnified human intention. And as the cities of Sumer grew, so did the ambitions of the men who ruled them. Soon kings would claim not only to defend cities, but to dominate entire regions. One ruler would unite rival lands under a new empire. Another would become a legend whose name still survives in one of the oldest stories ever written. And within that story, a powerful king would confront an enemy no city wall could defeat. Death itself. The rise of Sumer was not the achievement of a single ruler or a single generation. It was the result of centuries of experimentation, adaptation, and cooperation across one of the most demanding environments on Earth. Yet, as the cities flourished, another transformation quietly reshaped history. Leadership itself began to change. In the earliest periods, many scholars believe that temples held much of the administrative authority. Priests supervised agricultural production, managed storehouses, and organized religious ceremonies that reinforced the city's relationship with its patron deity. But prosperity brought new dangers. As neighboring city-states competed for fertile land, irrigation, canals, and trade routes, warfare became increasingly common. Military leadership became indispensable. Gradually, powerful war leaders emerged alongside the priesthood. Eventually, these leaders evolved into kings. Unlike later emperors who ruled vast territories, the earliest Sumerian kings governed individual city-states. Each city considered itself an independent political world. Uruk, Lagash, Kish, Nippur. Each possessed its own government, its own traditions, its own temples, and its own ambitions. Sometimes they traded peacefully. Just as often they fought. Archaeological discoveries reveal fortification walls, defensive structures, bronze weapons, and royal inscriptions, celebrating military victories. Victory was no longer simply survival. It became prestige. Kings commissioned monuments describing how they defeated rivals, captured prisoners, seized livestock, and expanded their influence. One of the most remarkable discoveries illustrating this new age is the Stele of the Vultures, dating to approximately the 25th century BC. Carved in stone, it commemorates the victory of Akhenaten, ruler of Lagash, over the neighboring city of Umma. The monument combines historical events with religious symbolism. On one side, disciplined soldiers march in formation behind their king. On the other, the city's patron deity participates in the triumph. To the Sumerians, warfare was never merely political. It reflected the will of the divine world. This blending of religion and government shaped every aspect of society. Kings did not simply claim political authority. They presented themselves as guardians of cosmic order. If canals functioned, crops flourished, and temples prospered, then heaven had blessed their reign. Failure suggested divine displeasure. Yet despite frequent warfare, Sumerian civilization continued producing extraordinary advances. Their mathematical system, based largely on the number 60, still influences modern life. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These conventions created thousands of years ago on the plains of Mesopotamia remain part of everyday life across the world. Astronomical observations became increasingly sophisticated. Priests carefully recorded the movements of the moon and visible planets. They observed eclipses. They tracked seasonal cycles. Their work was practical as well as religious. Agriculture depended upon accurate knowledge of seasonal change. Festivals followed celestial patterns. Calendars organized civic life. Although their understanding of the universe differed greatly from modern science, their commitment to systematic observation laid important foundations for later civilizations. Medicine also developed within Sumer. Clay tablets preserved treatments for wounds, illnesses, and infections. Some remedies reflected careful practical experience. Others combined physical treatments with prayers and ritual actions. To the Sumerians, disease often possessed both natural and spiritual dimensions. Healing, therefore, involved both physician and priest. Education likewise became increasingly organized. Young scribes attended schools where they copied signs repeatedly onto clay tablets. Learning cuneiform demanded patience, discipline, and years of practice. A skilled scribe occupied one of the most respected professions in society. He could read contracts, write official correspondence, record legal judgments, preserve literature, maintain royal archives. In a largely illiterate society, literacy itself became power. The written word gave governments remarkable advantages. Taxes could be recorded, property could be documented, trade agreements could be enforced. Royal decrees could survive long after a king's death. Writing transformed administration. It also transformed memory. For the first time, history itself could be preserved with extraordinary detail. Among the surviving texts are lists of kings stretching back into a distant past. One document in particular has fascinated historians for generations. It is known today as the Sumerian King List. The text records a succession of rulers, beginning before a great flood. Some early kings are assigned reigns lasting thousands of years. Following the flood, the recorded reigns gradually become shorter and increasingly realistic. To modern readers, these immense lifespans seem impossible. Yet the document remains historically valuable. It reveals how the Sumerians understood their own past. History, memory, theology, and royal legitimacy were woven together into a single narrative. Interestingly, the King List includes a catastrophic flood dividing two eras of history. Long before archaeologists translated this text, the biblical account of Noah had already described a worldwide flood, separating the old world from the new. The similarities have attracted enormous scholarly interest, but careful distinction is essential. The biblical narrative and Mesopotamian flood traditions are not identical. They differ in theology, purpose, and literary structure. Nevertheless, they demonstrate that memories of catastrophic flooding occupied an important place throughout the ancient Near East. Whether these traditions preserve recollections of regional disasters, shared cultural memories, or literary development, remains an active area of research. Archaeology can compare texts. It cannot fully reconstruct the events behind every ancient tradition. As Sumerian civilization matured, trade expanded dramatically. Caravans crossed deserts carrying copper, timber, precious stones, and textiles. Ships navigated rivers and the Persian Gulf. Materials unavailable in southern Mesopotamia arrived from distant lands. Lapis lazuli traveled from what is now Afghanistan. Cedar timber arrived from Lebanon. Copper came from Oman and surrounding regions. Trade connected civilizations, separated by thousands of kilometers. Sumer was no isolated society. It became the center of an international network stretching across much of the ancient world. With prosperity came increasing social complexity. Merchants accumulated wealth. Craftsmen specialized in luxury goods. Officials managed expanding bureaucracies. Temples controlled vast economic resources. Kings sought greater influence. Society became increasingly stratified. Some lived in impressive homes, furnished with imported goods. Others labored in fields or workshops with few opportunities to improve their circumstances. Civilization had created remarkable possibilities. It had also created profound inequalities. Yet perhaps the greatest achievement of Sumer was not any individual invention. It was the creation of a model. Nearly every major civilization that followed inherited something from the Sumerians. Writing, urban planning, administrative government, formal law, monumentale architecture, mathematics, recorded history, religious institutions, economic administration. The influence of Sumer reached far beyond its own lifetime. Even after Sumerian political dominance declined, its cultural legacy continued shaping Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian civilizations. Its language remained important in religious and scholarly contexts for centuries, much like Latin would later function in medieval Europe. Civilizations rose, empires collapsed, languages changed. But Sumer endured through the knowledge it had preserved. Its greatest monuments were not only built from brick, they were built from ideas that would influence humanity for thousands of years. Yet among all the stories preserved on those ancient clay tablets, one would outlive the civilization itself. It tells of a mighty king, a restless ruler, a friendship that transformed him, a journey beyond the limits of the known world, and humanity's desperate search for immortality. His name was Gilgamesh. His story would become one of the oldest surviving literary works in history. And through it we discover that even the greatest king of the world's first civilization could not escape the question that has haunted every generation. What does it truly mean to live, when every human life must one day come to an end? If the Sumerians invented the world's first cities, then Gilgamesh became the world's first legendary king. For more than 4,000 years, his name has survived the collapse of empires, the disappearance of languages, and the erosion of entire civilizations. His story was nearly forgotten forever. Then, during the 19th century, archaeologists excavating the ruins of the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh uncovered thousands of clay tablets within the royal library of King Ashurbanipal. Among those broken fragments lay one of humanity's oldest literary masterpieces, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Written in cuneiform and preserved across multiple copies, the epic tells the story of a powerful ruler who seemed to possess everything: strength, wealth, power, glory. Yet despite his greatness, Gilgamesh remained haunted by a fear that no king could conquer: death. According to the story, Gilgamesh ruled the magnificent city of Uruk. Archaeology confirms that Uruk was indeed one of the largest and most influential cities of the ancient world. Massive defensive walls surrounded the city. Temple complexes dominated its skyline. Trade flowed through its streets. Although historians cannot verify every detail of the epic, the city itself was undeniably real. This mixture of historical setting and legendary storytelling makes the Epic of Gilgamesh one of the most fascinating documents ever discovered. At the beginning of the narrative, Gilgamesh is not portrayed as an ideal ruler. He is proud, demanding, restless. His immense strength becomes a burden upon his own people. According to the story, the gods respond by creating another powerful man, Enkidu. Unlike Gilgamesh, Enkidu begins his life among the animals. He knows nothing of cities, nothing of kingship, nothing of civilization. He represents humanity in its untamed state. Eventually, Enkidu is drawn into human society. After a dramatic confrontation, he and Gilgamesh become close companions. Together, they embark upon dangerous expeditions that reveal both extraordinary courage and reckless ambition. They travel into the cedar forest, a place considered sacred. Its mighty trees were unlike anything found on the flat plains of southern Mesopotamia. Timber was one of the region's most valuable resources. The forest, therefore, represented both natural wealth and divine mystery. Guarding it was Humbaba, a terrifying being appointed by the gods. Against repeated warnings, Gilgamesh and Enkidu attack. They defeat Humbaba. They cut down the sacred cedars. They return home as celebrated heroes. But their triumph carries consequences. The balance between humanity and the divine has been broken. Soon afterward, another confrontation leads to tragedy. Enkidu becomes gravely ill. Despite prayers, sacrifices, and desperate hope, he dies. For Gilgamesh, everything changes. Until this moment, death had always happened to someone else. Now, it has entered his own life. He looks upon the body of his closest friend and realizes a terrifying truth. One day, he too will die. The greatest king of the greatest city cannot escape mortality. This realization drives the remainder of the epic. Gilgamesh abandons his throne and sets out on a journey unlike any before him. He is no longer searching for glory. He is searching for eternal life. His quest eventually leads him to Utnapishtim, a mysterious figure who survived a catastrophic flood and was granted extraordinary longevity. Here, the epic becomes especially important for historians. The flood account preserved within Gilgamesh shares notable similarities with other ancient Near Eastern flood traditions. A divine warning, a great vessel, the preservation of life, birds released after the waters begin to recede. These parallels have fascinated scholars for more than a century. Yet careful comparison also reveals significant differences. The theology of Genesis centers upon one sovereign creator, whose judgment and mercy unfold according to a coherent moral purpose. The Mesopotamian tradition presents multiple gods, whose decisions often reflect conflict, fear, or unpredictability. The stories intersect in interesting ways, but they are not interchangeable. Each belongs to its own literary and religious tradition. For historians, these similarities suggest that catastrophic flood memories circulated widely throughout the ancient Near East. Exactly how those traditions developed remains a matter of ongoing scholarly research. The archaeological evidence neither proves nor disproves the biblical narrative. Instead, it demonstrates that flood traditions formed an important part of the cultural memory of multiple civilizations. The journey continues. Utnapishtim eventually reveals the existence of a remarkable plant hidden beneath the waters. Whoever possesses it may regain youthful vitality. Gilgamesh dives into the depths. He succeeds. For the first time in his journey, hope returns. Perhaps humanity's oldest dream is finally within reach. But exhaustion overtakes him. While he sleeps beside a spring, a serpent silently approaches. It steals the plant and disappears. The king awakens to discover that everything has been lost. The serpent sheds its skin as it departs. Gilgamesh returns home with empty hands. Immortality remains beyond human grasp. This ending has echoed across thousands of years because it speaks to every generation. The mightiest civilization could build cities. It could invent writing. It could measure the heavens. It could organize kingdoms. But it could not conquer death. Perhaps that is why the Epic of Gilgamesh continues to resonate with readers today. It asks questions that remain deeply human. What gives life meaning? Can achievements outlive mortality? Will anyone remember us after we are gone? Can civilization itself provide the answers people seek? These questions extend beyond ancient Mesopotamia. They remain central to the human experience. For archaeologists, the epic provides another invaluable insight. It demonstrates that the Sumerians were not merely engineers and administrators. They were philosophers, storytellers, poets, observers of the human condition. Their literature explored grief, friendship, courage, pride, justice, and the search for purpose. Civilization was not measured solely by bricks and canals. It was also measured by ideas. And those ideas survived long after the cities themselves fell into ruin. Yet history rarely allows one civilization to remain dominant forever. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, the political landscape of Mesopotamia was beginning to change. New peoples entered the region. New languages spread across the fertile plains. Power shifted from one city-state to another. The independent cities that had once competed for influence would soon face a leader unlike any who had come before. A man who dreamed not merely of ruling one city, but of uniting them all under the world's first empire. His name was Sargon of Akkad, and with his rise, human history entered an entirely new age. History remembers only a handful of individuals whose ambitions permanently altered the course of civilization. Sargon of Akkad was one of them. Unlike the legendary Gilgamesh, Sargon stands on much firmer historical ground. Archaeological discoveries, royal inscriptions, and later, Mesopotamian records all point to a remarkable ruler who transformed the political landscape of the ancient Near East during the 24th century BC. Yet the story of Sargon begins not with certainty, but with legend. According to later Akkadian tradition, he was born under mysterious circumstances. His mother, described as a high priestess, secretly placed the infant into a basket, sealed with bitumen, and set him upon a river. The child drifted downstream until he was discovered and rescued by a gardener named Aki, who raised him as his own son. Whether this account reflects historical reality or royal propaganda remains unknown. Historians approach it with caution. The earliest records, written during Sargon's own lifetime, do not include this dramatic birth story. It appears centuries later, suggesting that it served to elevate the king's image, rather than preserve verified biography. Even so, the legend reveals something important. Ancient rulers often shaped narratives about their origins to demonstrate divine favor and legitimate their authority. Kings were expected to be extraordinary. Their stories reflected that expectation. Unlike the independent rulers of Sumerian city-states, Sargon envisioned something entirely different. He sought not merely to govern one city. He sought to unite many. Military campaigns carried his armies across Mesopotamia. City after city submitted to his authority. Some surrendered peacefully. Others resisted and were conquered. For perhaps the first time in recorded history, numerous city-states were incorporated into a single political system under one ruler. The Akkadian Empire had been born. Its creation marked one of the greatest turning points in human history. Until this moment, political power was largely local. A city's influence rarely extended far beyond its surrounding farmland and neighboring settlements. Sargon shattered that pattern. Governors loyal to the king administered distant regions. Roads connected territories. Trade expanded under centralized protection. Military garrisons maintained order. Communication stretched across unprecedented distances. Administration became increasingly sophisticated. The empire represented an entirely new scale of government. Its influence reached from the Persian Gulf toward the Mediterranean. For the first time, the idea of ruling vast multicultural territories became reality. Language also reflected this transformation. While Sumerian continued as an important literary and religious language, Akkadian gradually became the dominant language of administration throughout much of Mesopotamia. Written using adapted cuneiform script, Akkadian would remain one of the ancient world's most influential languages for well over 1,000 years. Diplomats, kings, merchants, priests, scribes, all would eventually use Akkadian to communicate across enormous distances. The empire had not erased Sumer. It had absorbed it. This pattern would repeat throughout history. Victorious civilizations often inherited the knowledge of those they conquered. The Greeks absorbed Egypt. Rome absorbed Greece. The Islamic Golden Age preserved and expanded classical learning. Knowledge rarely vanished completely. It evolved. The same was true in ancient Mesopotamia. The achievements of Sumer became the foundation upon which Akkadian civilization continued to build. Cities still flourished. Temples remained central. Scribes continued copying ancient texts. Engineers maintained irrigation systems. Farmers cultivated fertile fields. Life continued even as political authority shifted. Yet no empire lasts forever. Despite remarkable military success, the Akkadian Empire eventually weakened. Internal unrest, environmental pressures, economic difficulties, and invasions combined to undermine centralized control. Ancient texts even describe periods of severe drought and agricultural hardship. Modern climate researchers have investigated whether prolonged environmental changes may have contributed to the empire's decline. Some geological evidence suggests that significant climatic shifts affected parts of Mesopotamia during this period. Exactly how much these changes influenced political collapse remains debated. History rarely offers simple explanations. Empires usually fall because multiple pressures converge at once. Military challenges, economic instability, leadership crises, environmental change, population movement. The Akkadian Empire was no exception. As centralized authority weakened, independent powers gradually re-emerged. Among them, one city would eventually rise above all others: Babylon. At first, Babylon was relatively modest compared with older Sumerian centers. Nothing suggested that it would one day become one of history's most famous cities. Yet geography favored it. Located along major trade routes and supported by the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, Babylon steadily increased in influence. Centuries later, under rulers such as Hammurabi and eventually Nebuchadnezzar II, it would dominate the ancient Near East. Its name would become synonymous with power, wealth, engineering, and human ambition. Long before Babylon reached its greatest glory, however, another remarkable development was taking place. Law itself was becoming more systematic. Every society requires rules. But as cities grew larger and governments more complex, unwritten customs no longer proved sufficient. Property disputes, commercial agreements, marriage contracts, inheritance, criminal punishment, agricultural responsibilities, all demanded consistency. Some of the earliest legal traditions appeared in Sumer. Later, rulers expanded and refined them. Eventually, these efforts culminated in one of the ancient world's most famous legal monuments, the Code of Hammurabi. Although created centuries after the rise of Sumer, it reflected a long tradition of Mesopotamian legal thought that stretched back to the earliest city-states. Law became another enduring legacy of the civilization born between the rivers. Looking back across these centuries, a remarkable pattern emerges. The world's first civilization did far more than build cities. It created systems of writing, systems of law, systems of government, systems of trade, systems of education, systems of religion. Many have changed dramatically over thousands of years. Yet their basic principles remain recognizable today. Modern governments still keep records. Courts still preserve written judgments. Cities still depend upon infrastructure. International trade still links distant societies. Education still transmits knowledge across generations. The foundations laid in ancient Mesopotamia continue to echo throughout the modern world. But perhaps the greatest lesson of Sumer is not technological. It is profoundly human. Civilization can produce extraordinary achievements. It can build magnificent cities, preserve knowledge, expand prosperity, encourage innovation. Yet every civilization also faces the same enduring questions. How should power be used? Who should benefit from prosperity? Can justice keep pace with ambition? What happens when pride replaces wisdom? These questions confronted Sumer. They confronted Akkad. They confronted Babylon. And they continue to confront every civilization today. The ruins scattered across modern Iraq do not merely preserve broken bricks. They preserve humanity's earliest attempt to answer those questions. Some answers changed the world. Others became warnings remembered for thousands of years. And among those warnings, one story would outlive every empire that told it. A city united. A tower rising toward heaven. A people determined to make a name for themselves. The next chapter in our journey leads to one of history's most enduring mysteries, the Tower of Babel. By the time Babylon rose to dominate Mesopotamia, the civilization that had first transformed the world had largely disappeared. The Sumerian language slowly faded from everyday conversation. Independent Sumerian kingdoms vanished from political maps. Many of their great cities were abandoned, damaged by war-changing rivers, environmental pressures, or the simple passage of time. The voices that once echoed through temple courtyards fell silent. The markets emptied. The canals filled with silt. The towering temples gradually crumbled beneath centuries of wind and sand. For generations, the world forgot they had ever existed. Even the Bible never uses the word Sumer. Instead, it refers to places that later occupied the same landscape, Shinar, Babylon, and the great cities of Mesopotamia. The people themselves disappeared into history. But their ideas did not. Civilizations often leave behind monuments. Sumer left behind systems. When archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamia during the 19th century, they expected to recover artifacts from Assyria and Babylon. Instead, they uncovered something even older. Layer beneath layer of forgotten cities emerged from the earth. Thousands of clay tablets, broken statues, cylinder seals, administrative records, royal inscriptions, school exercises, poems, religious hymns, business contracts, mathematical calculations. It became clear that beneath Babylon had stood an older civilization. Beneath the empire known to the Bible had stood the people who first transformed villages into cities. The discovery astonished historians. Entire chapters of human history had been missing. Now they could finally be read again. The decipherment of cuneiform unlocked a world that had been silent for nearly 2,000 years. The Sumerians returned, not as living people, but as voices preserved in clay. Their own words described their kings, their merchants, their farmers, their priests, their fears, their hopes, their achievements, their failures. For the first time, humanity could read the thoughts of one of its earliest civilizations. The picture that emerged was neither perfect nor primitive. The Sumerians were brilliant innovators. They engineered irrigation systems across difficult landscapes. They developed sophisticated mathematics. They created one of humanity's first writing systems. They established schools for scribes. They built monumental architecture requiring remarkable coordination. They organized governments capable of managing tens of thousands of people. Their achievements laid foundations that still influence the modern world. Yet archaeology also reveals another side of their story. Cities competed constantly. Kings pursued conquest. Social inequality expanded. Political struggles intensified. Religious institutions accumulated enormous wealth and influence. Prosperity brought ambition. Ambition often brought conflict. The first civilization displayed humanity at both its best and its worst. This dual reality remains one of the most important lessons Sumer offers today. Technology alone does not create justice. Knowledge alone does not create wisdom. Economic success alone does not create peace. Civilization can increase human capability without transforming human character. That observation echoes across every age of history. Modern societies possess technologies the Sumerians could never have imagined. We communicate across continents in seconds. We explore space. We decode the human genome. Artificial intelligence performs calculations beyond the ability of ancient scribes. Yet the fundamental questions remain remarkably familiar. How should power be used? What responsibilities accompany knowledge? Can prosperity exist without exploitation? Can justice keep pace with innovation? The world's first civilization asked these questions through experience. Every civilization since has continued asking them. Perhaps that is why Sumer still matters. It is not simply the story of an ancient people. It is the opening chapter of our own story. The city planner, the engineer, the teacher, the merchant, the judge, the writer, the politician, the architect, the farmer. Every one of these roles can trace part of its history back to the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. The Sumerians did not invent humanity, but they helped invent civilization. Their influence survived the collapse of their cities, because ideas are often stronger than empires. Bricks crumble, languages disappear, dynasties fall, knowledge endures. Standing today among the ruins of Ur-Uruk or Eridu, it is difficult to imagine that these weathered mounds once represented the most advanced society on Earth. The silence is almost overwhelming. Only the wind moves across the ancient landscape. Yet beneath that silence lies the memory of millions of lives. Children learning to write their first cuneiform signs. Farmers guiding water into newly planted fields. Merchants preparing caravans for distant journeys. Builders lifting mud bricks toward enormous temple platforms. Priests offering prayers as smoke drifted into the morning sky. Kings believing their names would live forever. Most of those names have indeed survived. Not because their kingdoms remained, but because human curiosity refused to let them disappear. Archaeology gave them a second life. Every excavation continues to add new pieces to the story. Every translated tablet deepens our understanding. Every discovery reminds us that history is never truly finished. There are still cities waiting beneath the soil, still inscriptions waiting to be read, still questions waiting to be answered. The search continues. As our journey through ancient Mesopotamia comes to an end, another story begins to emerge from these same fertile plains. It is a story preserved not only in archaeology, but also in one of the Bible's most memorable narratives. A united humanity, one language, one ambitious city, a tower reaching toward heaven. For centuries, people imagined it as little more than a moral tale. Today, archaeology paints a far richer and more fascinating picture. What inspired the story of Babel? Did monumental temple towers influence the biblical account? What can excavated cities reveal about one of history's most famous mysteries? Those questions lead us naturally into the next chapter of Eden Archives. Because after the birth of civilization came humanity's greatest ambition, the Tower of Babel. And that is where our story continues. End of documentary.